Okay, I think we'll get going. Hi to everyone. My name is Win Saldani. I'm the chairman of the 116th Chicago Yacht Club Race to Mackinac, presented by Wintrust. And thank you for joining us tonight for what I think is going to be a pretty interesting seminar. Chris, if you go ahead and forward here. So I wanted to start things off talking a little bit about what the origins of this seminar were, because the Race to Mackinac Committee has been thinking about this topic for some time. So the first reason that we're here, Chris, if we'll just go ahead. When we think about the Chicago Mac, it's certainly not the only offshore race in the world, but it is kind of unique amongst offshore races in that we interact with severe weather an awful lot here, severe convective weather particularly. We're sitting, just east of the Great Plains. We're sitting in a part of the country where at that time of year, like the severe weather is pretty common. And on average, we're interacting with severe weather of some kind every other year, pretty much in this race. And this is chronicled by a lot of people in a lot of places. Like there are case studies written about how often we're impacted by severe storms, which leads to my next point, which is that we are also reaching this time in technology where we got Starlink out there. We got more satellite connectivity out there. We got our phones that we can look at out on the lake now. And that means that our fleet has on the water access to weather data and tools like NWS Doppler radar that Chris is going to be talking a lot about, that allows us to track severe weather and to be prepared for it. One point to add here is that a lot of the severe weather that we see in this race is at night. That's just the nature of the convective weather that we deal with here. And having a tool like radar sounds really, really awesome. And having it in our hands sounds really, really awesome. So what we want to do today, Chris, to the next point, is like we want to help our fleet understand this is a great tool, but it has peculiarities that make it more or less useful in certain situations. You watch the TV weathercasters, you look at your app, and you generally say, look, red is bad, green is good. I got this. If there's no reflectivity, I get it. There's no rain, right? But it's really not quite that simple. And really understanding the strengths and limitations of weather radar, it's key to properly using it as part of your safety toolkit. So to the next point, Chris, our goal tonight is to help us all be better consumers of Doppler radar and its applications so that we can be safe on the water. Again, I think it's really easy to take for granted that, green is good, red is bad, and we go from there. So next page, please. So a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce Chris. Number one, this is being recorded and will be available online afterwards. We'll send out the link. It's going to be on the Mac YouTube page, and we'll send out the link, as I said, for you can share it with crew and others. We're working on opening the chat right now. And once the chat is open, I ask that you please put questions inside of there. We have a break built in partway through the presentation to answer some of the questions from the chat. And then afterwards, we're going to end the presentation with a Q&A session. Kevin, the vice chair of the race, who's also here, and I will be calling through the questions in chat and presenting those to Chris at those points in the presentation. So again, I apologize. The chat will be open in just a minute here, I believe. So next page. I hope everyone here knows Chris Bedford. It's hard for me sometimes to find the accolades to describe Chris. He's currently the meteorologist for SailGP. He hates when I do this. You can tell by his body language. He's currently the meteorologist for SailGP. The guy's been a part of 11 America's Cup campaigns, which is more than any other meteorologist. His world records are incredible. He's coached 17 Olympic medals, which if you put him on the list of Olympic medal winners in all time, he's behind Michael Phelps and a Soviet gymnast from the 1960s. They're the only people who are responsible for medals in it. But most importantly, I've known Chris since 2009 when he became involved in the MAC race most recently, and I count him among one of my best friends. So it's an honor, and I'm humbled, and thank you so much, Chris, for doing this for us in our fleet.
Thanks, Win. Just don't ask me to do the Iron Cross on the rings anytime soon to win a gold medal. But thanks very much. And I think it's great that you put this together for all the reasons that you brought forward. We're really impacted significantly by severe weather. And one of your points in particular about how a lot of the severe weather happens at night, which is not typical of severe weather, I guess. You know, you think of the tornadic storms and stuff over the southern plains, for instance. Those happen because of the heating of the day, and they kind of peak in the late afternoon and evening, and then they die at night when things cool off. But the weather in the summer times different in the high plains and the Great Lakes, and so a lot of those bad thunderstorms happen at night. And being at night makes them even worse because you can't really see them coming. You know, in the daylight, you can see a storm coming from, you know, quite some distance away, but at night you can't. So what do? You fall back on the resources that you have, radar being a big one of them. So it's important that we understand what radar is showing us, what it can do for us, and what it can't do for us. And we're going to try and talk a little bit about that today. Um, you know, every time you do one of these courses, I feel like people have very lofty expectations, like they're going to walk away after a 1 hour presentation and they're going to be experts in whatever I'm talking about. The sad fact of the matter is, a lot of what I talk about are the weaknesses and the things it can't do for you. But when you're using something, it's really important to understand that. It's really important to understand that these tools can't do everything for you. At the end of the day, it's still your responsibility to sail smart, sail safe, and act accordingly out on the water. Keep your crew safe and be ready to handle whatever Mother Nature throws at you. I am going to sort of point to some tools here as I go through this presentation. I'm not giving any recommendations here. There's lots of tools out there that allow you to look at and analyze radar information. But I'm not advocating the use of any particular tool here. Really, it's up to you, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on what you use. So with that disclaimer, as Wynn said, we are impacted frequently by severe weather during this race. And any racing that you do on the Great Lakes in the summertime is at risk of being impacted by severe thunderstorms. So I thought I just would do a little brief history here of recent history of storms across the lake. And here's 2016, for example. And there was what's called an MCS. I'll describe what an MCS is a little bit later. That moved across the southern part of the lake and impacted the fleet Saturday afternoon and early Sunday morning. On the weather map there, you see a little stationary front that MCS was sort of riding down that front across the southern part of the lake. The next year, 2017, we had a cold front that moved south through the lake from the upper lake to the southern lake as the fleet was moving north. And you had to cross that. And while there weren't really any severe thunderstorms, there certainly were thunderstorms and gust fronts, outflow boundaries, et cetera, all the things that you find and impact you as you're sailing up the lake. 2018, next year, here we go, 3 years in a row, was kind of an unusual year for the Great Lakes. We had a cutoff low pressure area. That one actually originated out in the Pacific Ocean and moved all the way across the northern tier into the Great Lakes just in time for the race to start, and had kind of general unsettled weather with it. And there were a few embedded thunderstorms associated with that. Again, nothing was severe that year, but thunderstorms were certainly present on the lake. Then 2022 came along, and that was a big year for thunderstorms on the lake. An extended period of convective systems moved across the lake. This is one of them coming across the lake. Then there was another one. That one moved out to the east. Another one developed right behind it, came in across the lake. That moved across the lake, and another one developed behind that and came across the lake. So we had this extended sort of 9 to 12-hour period of intense weather moving across the lake. This is the radar loop that shows that weather pattern coming across the lake. And you can see this first area, this first cluster of storms coming across the lake. And creating what's called a bow echo as it did so, strong wind gusts associated with that. Another one coming through here and another one passing through. This one actually developed a kind of circulation, low pressure circulation as it moved across the lake. So just wave after wave of intense thunderstorms moved across the lake. So as I said, hugely impactful to us. 2023, more thunderstorms. These were different kind of storms. These are air mass thunderstorms, and they basically formed along the uh, Illinois and Wisconsin lakeshore at the boundary between the lake breeze and the gradient wind, and then they moved. Upper level winds pushed them offshore. So again, another impactful day. And then, of course, last year we had that thunderstorm complex, another MCS that moved across the lake. MCSs are very common in the Great Lakes, and again, they tend to be nighttime, late afternoon into nighttime systems. So it's really important. Radar becomes a really important tool to look at those. Now, we're all coming from different levels of education and understanding of what radar is. So some of this information might be kind of basic to those of you familiar, but for those people that aren't, just thought I'd run through some of the fundamentals of how weather radar works. In the United States, we have a system called NEXRAD, which is stands for Next Generation Radar. They're going to have to change that name because NEXRAD actually started in the 80s and was deployed fully in the 90s. So we've got another generation or two that's gone through. But it has been recently upgraded. They're trying to basically keep the radars modern to the point where even the hardware, such as the towers and the bases of the radars, are being replaced now to extend their life another 30, 40 years, hopefully. But basically what happens is on the left is what the radar looks like out in the field. It's got a radome over it. Underneath it is this dish. That dish spins both horizontally and then it can tilt vertically. And what it does is it sends out a bit of a pulse of microwave energy, an S-band, which I believe is something like 2,000 gigahertz frequency. And that's sent out from the radar. And then after that pulse, there's a quiet period where the radar listens. And what it's listening for is any returned energy in nearly that same wave, same frequency. It listens for a range around that value, and in any return, it can take both the strength of that return, which means it bounced off of something. Did it bounce off something big or numerous, like a large droplet or many droplets of water? Or is it just little tiny droplets out there? And the strength of that return tells you basically how heavy it's raining. And then also it knows what time the pulse was sent, how fast light travels, and when it received that, so it knows how far away that reflected pulse comes from, where that reflected pulse comes from. And so with that, you can get both the strength and the distance. And so you take that information and you accumulate it and you create a picture of what the weather is doing. And I put this very dramatic picture up here on purpose. This is a hurricane moving into the Texas coast, but basically the radar is sending out a pulse and it gets a return and it can create this image. One of the advantages of using the S-band is while it can attenuate somewhat as it goes through precipitation, it tends to be able to penetrate even heavy rain. And so even though the radar is going through one side of the eye wall in this radar, it's still able, in this hurricane, it's still able to see the other side because enough energy gets through there. And so we're able to put these images together. And the way the sort of the convention is that if you have the warmer colors, like the red, yellows and the reds here, you have heavier precipitation. If you have cooler colors like greens and down to blues, those are either smaller droplets, fewer droplets, a light rain, or even drizzle. Sometimes it's just cloud droplets that it's able to see and return. And so all that information, and it's a lot of it, you're able to get to put together from the radar by the pulse that it sends out. Now, it's just not looking at the amplitude of the return signal, it's also looking at the frequency. So as I said, it senses a range of frequencies around the pulse, the frequency that it's sent out in the original pulse. And any returns, it can see what the frequency change is. And from that, you can infer what the speed of the droplets are. So as it bounces off the droplets, if the droplets are moving away from the radar, then the return frequency is returned lower. If the droplets are moving toward the radar, then the return frequency is shifted higher. And by measuring the amount of the frequency shift, you can infer what the speed of the droplets are. This is called the Doppler effect. And so the radar listens for the frequency shifts, and from that, it's able to calculate at the elevation that it sees the droplets, what the speed of the droplets either away or toward the radar is. And this is very important, of course, to pick out certain things in the flow. Number one, how strong is the wind at the level that the radar is looking, but also if there's any circulation. So for example, if there's a tornado in a very localized area, the wind will shift from blowing toward the radar to blowing away from the radar. And if that happens over a very small distance, then you can infer that there's a tornado in that location. So in the absence of direct observation, in other words, no one actually seeing the tornado, like happens at night, for example, and in the rare instance when there's no tornado chasers, then you can see know that there's tornadoes there, or very likely tornadoes there. So that imagery is also developed a sort of a convention for it. And I'd put the same hurricane because hurricanes, the Doppler images are very dramatic and relatively easy to interpret. And so on the left here is the precipitation image, and on the right is the same velocity image for that hurricane. And so the cold colors are where the wind is flowing toward the radar. So our radar is located where this yellow star is. And so the wind is flowing toward the radar site here where the colors are blue. Where the colors are warmer, like down through here, the wind is blowing away from the radar. And so what we end up seeing is the circulation around the hurricane here. And also you can get an idea of what the speed of the flow is around the hurricane. And so obviously very valuable information. Now, one of the tricks of this, and one of the, I guess, weak downsides, again, this is what you have to interpret when you're looking at this image, is the radar only measures if the droplets are flowing toward the radar or away from the radar. It's only measuring the speed of flow along the axis of the beam. So if the droplets are flowing exactly perpendicular to the beam, then it'll show zero Doppler shift or zero velocity. And you can see, for example, very easily where the velocity is zero, where it zeroes out between flow toward the radar here to flow away from the radar down here. And it's this line right here that extends toward the center of the radar. And so that's one important thing to understand if you ever decide to look at velocity image is you have to look at it and interpret it to understand what the direction of the flow actually is. And just because there's this line here doesn't mean that there's zero wind. It just means that the flow of the droplets is perpendicular to the radar beam at that point. So again, important things to understand when you're looking at the radar image. All right, trying to find my pointer, which seems to have disappeared on me. There we go. Okay. All right, so here's another look at Doppler radar, and this is actually from the 2004 event that I spoke about earlier, MCS moving southeast across the lake, in this case moving south from Wisconsin into northern Illinois. And this is the Chicago radar, which is located where the star is. Again, it's important when you're looking at velocity data in particular to know where the radar is located. And so we have this this storm moving south right through here. And you can see the greens, the cooler colors of the air moving toward the radar. But down to the south of this point down here, you'll see some reds. This is actually low-level cumulus cloud, and the flow is away from the radar here across Chicago. So the flow is basically showing some sort of westerly component away from the radar. But up here we have strong flow coming from the north. And so along this line right here that is moving into the north, there is an abrupt wind shift between this westerly wind over across Chicago and out into the lake, and this northerly wind coming down, northerly component wind coming down with the storms. Notice how the wind goes to to more the zero color as you get out to the west here with these storms out here. That's because the wind is now blowing more from the northeast out here. You can't tell the speed, but you know what the direction is by that inference, because it's blowing perpendicular to the radar beam, which is extending out from the Chicago radar. Likewise, up here, just to the north, east and across the lake, you see the reds. And so there's an area here where the flow is perpendicular to the radar. And then out here, it's flowing away from the radar. So that would be out at the other side of this, the eastern side of this arc of cloud here. And that's the outflow coming from that side of the storm. So you can infer all those types of things by looking at the radar image, but again, it requires interpretation. All right, so what are things that impact your interpretation of the radar? Well, there's some physical and operational characteristics of the radar you probably should be aware of. The first one is beam spreading. Then there's an effect that the radar on the radar data, because the Earth curves and the radar is basically looking at higher in the atmosphere, further from the radar. There's a physical limitation on how low the radar can actually look. Number one, you don't want it pointing too low onto the ground, because the beam will actually pick up too much reflection off the surface close to the radar, and that will attenuate the radar signal. So you want to minimize that. So you have to actually look a little bit up, almost right off the bat, unless the radar is located up on a elevated piece of terrain or something. And then also changes in atmospheric density change how the beam reacts as it goes through the atmosphere. Just like glass changes light, bends light, changes in the density of the atmosphere will bend light and microwaves, and so that will affect how the radar reacts. The type of imagery that you're looking at will affect your interpretation, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, whatever tools you use to analyze. Some tools you're able to analyze some things, other tools you're able to analyze something different. So what is beam spreading? Well, as the radar beam extends away from the radar, it spreads at an angle of about 1 degree. So what does that mean? Well, the width of the beam approximately 1 mile from approximately 50 miles from the radar is 1 mile wide. So 50 miles from the radar, it's looking at a 1 mile wide area and returning all the energy that is accumulated within that 1 mile area. Then when you get 100 miles from the radar, it's a 2 mile wide beam. So what does this mean? Well, if you look at the image on the right, the radar is located where this green circle is, right here. And close to the radar, you'll notice that there's very high resolution. There's lots of pixels, and that's because you're close to the radar and the beam's still pretty narrow. Then when you get further out from the radar, you'll notice how the radar image looks kind of blurry, and the image, the pixels are sort of spread out as if someone had taken a piece of paper on wet ink and smeared it. And that's lower resolution, and that's because the radar beam is wider. So you can see more detail, more features when the precipitation is falling close to the radar than you can when the precipitation is further away from the radar. So that's the effect of beam spreading. The next thing is Earth curvature. So the beam goes out in more or less a straight line. It actually bends a little bit due to the density changes in the atmosphere, but more or less a straight line. Meanwhile, the Earth curves underneath it. And so at the lowest elevation, which is typically around 0.5 degree elevation. That's the lowest elevation that the radar can beam goes out at. Some do go a little bit lower than that, as I said, if they can. Some are fixed a little bit higher because they have obstructions close to the radar they need to shoot over. The radar beam goes out, and it's progressively seeing higher and higher in the atmosphere relative to the spot it's passing over the Earth. And so this is sort of shocking information if you never thought about this before. But at its lowest elevation angle at 50 miles, the beam is 4,060 feet above the surface. And at 100 miles, it's 12,560. So almost 1 mile high in the atmosphere at 50 miles and 2 miles high in the atmosphere at 100 miles. So when at 50 miles from the radar, it's not seeing what's happening at the surface. It's seeing what's happening almost a mile up. And at 100 miles, it's seeing what's happening at almost 2 miles up. And this sort of picture of a cumulonimbus cloud gives you an idea. If you're close to the radar, you're seeing the base of the cloud. If you're far from the radar, you're seeing well up into the cloud. And so one of the results of this, of course, is that if you're trying to interpret how the wind is behaving at the surface, you have to remember that the radar is actually above you. So it's returning what is happening above you. And there can be huge changes in the wind field at the surface where you are relative to what's happening where the radar is. So very important to understand that. The bottom, this image here shows the effect of Earth's curvature. So there's two views of a supercell thunderstorm near Fort Worth. One where the radar is 20 miles away and the beam is about 1,300 feet above the ground level. And you can see really great detail. You can see a hook echo, which is likely where there's a tornado, could be a tornado there. See great detail. But at 90 miles from the radar, the beam's 11,600 feet above the ground, and you don't see any of that detail. And so this is one of the important things to understand about radar. Here's sort of graphical representation of how the beam is both spreading, how the beam spread works, but also how the change in the beam height works with distance from the radar. So here we are looking at the beam spreading at 50 miles from the radar. The beam's almost a mile wide, and 100 miles from the radar, it's 2 miles wide and another mile higher. So you're really not you need to understand that most thunderstorms are strong thunderstorms are sort of up in the 30, 40,000 foot range. And so but we live down here at the surface, obviously, and there's big differences in what's happening. Just for your reference, this is a chart that shows you what the coverage is at 6,000 feet from the radars. All the boxes here show you where the radars are. And at 6,000 feet, this area here is fully covered. However, down closer to the surface at 3,000 feet, this is the coverage. So actually through the middle of the lake, no radar is seeing below 3,000 feet. And in fact, it's seeing closer to a mile high in the middle of the lake, down through this section, down through here, between Milwaukee, for instance, and Muskegon. And then up at the upper part of the lake, just the Houghton Lake radar is seeing just below 3,000 feet, just in this off of the Traverse City area. This is, yes, last year's storm with the 3,000 foot radar coverage on it. And so you can see here where the storm was passing through this area here, where the radar was seeing well above 3,000 feet. And so it's actually not saying that. And that's no radar was seeing. The Milwaukee and the Grand Rapids radar were the two primary radars for that storm in the middle part of the lake. And no radar was seeing below 3,000 feet in that section. The other thing that I said that affects your interpretation is the tools that you're using. And radar apps are how we all access radar now. And but when you look at the imagery on your app, it's going to be different between different apps. And it's important that you understand that different apps have different resolution, they have a different look and feel, and they have different update times. So the radars update anywhere, depending on how they're operating, anywhere from every 3 to 6 minutes. But whoever's running your app will be drawing their data from different databases, and it takes time for the collection of the data, processing of the data, and then eventually getting to your app. And that can be as much as 10 to 15 minutes. So if you're not careful, you could be looking at old data. And we know that things change very rapidly on the Great Lakes. And so it's important to understand how quickly your app is updating. The other thing is, what type of imagery are you looking at? On the left is a composite image. So basically it's taking all the different radar that it has available to create one sort of seamless image of radar. The one on the right is a single site radar image. And what we find is that in single site radar, the update rate tends to be faster and the imagery is in higher detail. But the advantage of a composite imagery here on the left is there are no gaps and it looks prettier. There's no gaps. You don't have all this noise like you have on the single site radar app, which is the one on the right. Now, the cons, of course, are that the single site radar is noisy. It has a lot of information in there that sort of confuses the interpretation a little bit. But the composite image is smoothed. And so it may miss out on some of the important details that are actually there that don't show up on, that would show up on a single site radar. So here's a great example of that difference. On the left is a composite image. On the right is a single site radar image. This imagery comes from a report of a sinking of a duck boat down in Branson, Missouri. And the operators had access to the image on the left. If they had had access to the image on the right, they would have noticed this little fine line of blue. That's an outflow boundary, which brought winds of 70 knots. The actual rain was still back up to the north. The accident site where that red dot is was 70 knot winds from that outflow boundary, but the rain hadn't even gotten there yet. If you look over at the composite image, you don't see any sign of that outflow boundary. So depending on what imagery you're looking at, what tool you're using to look at the imagery, you'll get different interpretation. Were there any questions that you wanted to put forth?
Yeah, Chris, so there have been a couple of questions about sort of what app you would recommend or what app you would, suggest people use. And there's a related question there about, gosh, SiriusXM and SiriusXM compared to those apps and if they update faster or slower. So maybe you could double click into those couple of topics. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that first of all, the app you choose, you have to understand what it's showing you. And I'm actually an advocate of multiple apps. So there are some apps that are very good at showing composite imagery. There are other apps that are very good at showing single site radar imagery and allowing you to do analysis of it. So it really depends on one, what's your level of understanding of the information is, and number two, how detailed you want to get. You can get very detailed, but if you don't understand what you're looking at, the app's going to be no help to you. So it's very important. The next thing is look and see in the documentation of your app to see if it gives what the frequency update rate is and what, if any, delay there is between the radar site and the update time on the app. Normally, composite imagery will lag more than single site radar imagery. That's an important one. So in a fast moving, changing weather situation, you want to look at the single site radar apps. On a sort of a general weather situation, general weather pattern, you want to look at the composite apps. As far as what apps to look at, there's many choices out there. I believe XM is a composite app. So, but I do not know what the update rate is on it or the lag time is on it. So you probably should check with SiriusXM to see what they're actually what they say their update rate and lag time is. Anything else?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. You got a lot of people's attention, I think, with that outflow boundary, and there are a couple of questions that came up here about, can you always see an outflow boundary as the blue line, or does it have to be raining for you to see that outflow boundary? So I didn't know if you're going to be talking more about outflow boundaries in your visualization later on, or wanted to take that on now. Perfect. Perfect
We are
segue.
talking all about outflow boundaries because that's what matters. When we have wind problems on the Great Lakes associated with thunderstorms, it's almost all due to outflow boundaries or something that would cause an outflow boundary. So when the outflow boundary is basically where the strongest winds are found. Now, there may be stronger winds back closer to the thunderstorm cell, but normally the outflow boundary arrives first, and it oftentimes arrives before the rain does. And so seeing outflow boundaries is important. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about the different types of storms. The first type is the single cell storm. And here I have an image of a couple of single cell storms that formed on the lake breeze boundary as it moved inland. So they form in low shear environments. In other words, the wind direction and speed is not changing a lot with altitude. They're usually very strong updrafts, but short-lived. So the storm grows very quickly and rains itself out very quickly. But when it's going through that raining out period, sort of as you see down here, this shows the life cycle of one of these single cell storms. It grows very quickly. It starts to rain at 20 minutes, and by 30 minutes, it's already raining itself out. When it's going through that period of from mature to dissipation, it can create a very strong downdraft, which in turn can create a strong outflow boundary. So it's important to be aware of that when you have these single cell systems that sort of in the development stage, they're not oftentimes not severe. It's when they're actually starting to dissipate that they can create strong winds. Another type of storm that we have on the Great Lakes are what's called multicellular storms. And these are basically storms that have multiple cells that are all in different phases of development. There's cells that are in the development stage, there's mature cells, and then there's dissipating cells, and they kind of work with each other. So in this display here on the right, the time zero is this first image. We can see cell 1 back here is actually a dissipating cell. Cell 2 is a mature cell, and cell 3 is a developing cell. Cell 4 is just beginning to initiate. And so they work together. The first cell actually helped the second cell develop, the second cell helping the third cell develop, et cetera. The colors here are supposed to represent what the radar would be seeing. So what the radar would be seeing with height. And so you can see that the cells that are heaviest will have that are mature have a core of very heavy precipitation, sort of right in the middle of the cell. And that's where the air is flowing down at high speed, and then it's flowing out. If you look very closely at this image, you'll see there's a little blue line like a cold front, and that's the outflow from this cell. So the outflow boundary is actually extending some distance away from the parent cell and actually out ahead of the precipitation, and the new cell is developing on that outflow boundary. That's why I said these cells sort of work together to coexist. And so multicellular storms are also very common, and they go through various stages. And on the radar, it almost looks like they're breathing as they move along. And so you got one cell that's growing and intensifying, then it looks like it's weakening, and then all of a sudden a new cell comes close by that is sort of the next generation. And so it just looks like it's breathing. This would be the sort of outflow boundary look of a multicellular storm. So the storm that is mature has this outflow boundary here with the wind flowing outward from the cell in kind of in all directions here, and then a new cell developing down here on this outflow boundary down there. So this would be a multicellular storm. So this storm here is mature, but it's on its way to dying. The next cell that's going to be the important growing one is this one that's down here to the southwest. So that shows you in principle how that looks. And again, noting how this is what the radar would show, the heaviest rain here, the actual outflow boundary, the wind shift and the strong winds are some distance out ahead of where the actual rainfall is. Okay. The next thing is, hold on a second. Hold 1 second. I seem to have lost my, apologies, everyone. I've lost control of my screen for a second. Are you still there?
We're still here.
Okay, sorry about that. I've lost control of my screen. Okay. And we're back, folks. Apologies. All right. So this is a radar interpretation of a
So
multicellular.
we can't see your screen yet, Chris.
Oh yeah, sorry. Apologies. Okay, should be coming back now.
Not quite yet.
Yep. 1 minute. There we go.
There
Okay.
we go.
All right. Yep. Sorry. So this is a radar interpretation of a multicellular storm just off of Milwaukee. And we can see on the right there multiple cells. But notice this boundary right there. That's the outflow boundary. And it's very prominent, and that's where the wind shift is and where the stronger winds are behind that boundary as it moves away from the radar site. Down here is the Doppler image of that. And the red is air flowing away from the radar. So that's up in the cloud up there. But the outflow boundary down lower is actually in a clear slot. And so there's no precipitation there, nothing for the radar to bounce off of. And so the Doppler isn't indicating any wind speed there. But there is the outflow boundary. You can tell because there's reflectivity along the front of that boundary. So important to understand how to interpret those. One other thing I want to point out is notice how the outflow boundary appears to end out here in the lake. Why is that? Because it's far from the radar site and the outflow boundary is now below the elevation of the radar. So out in the middle of the lake, there is an outflow boundary there. You just can't see it because the radar is shooting over the top of it. All right, so let's take a look at this in motion. You can see the outflow boundary moving away from the storms, moving to the south, and new cells developing to the southwest of the original cell. This is the multicellular effect of these storms. The first ones are dying as they move over the lake, and new cells developing to the southwest, sort of upflow. The prevailing flow of the gradient flow is from the southwest. The new cells form on the upwind side of the primary one. All right, then there's squall line storms. This is sort of the one and done idea of thunderstorms on the Great Lakes. And these are usually associated with frontal passages, and they're multi-celled storms, but they form along a boundary, and they basically move linearly across the lakes. And as I said, usually they're one and done, and they're relatively fast moving storms. So that's the typical squall line. And then here's the MCS idea. So this is multiple cells all working together to create a kind of system of flow around it. And if you look, you see this sort of this round, or what's referred to as a bow echo look to the storm. And here's how it initially develops as a line, and then the center of the line starts to move faster, and it forms into this bow. And usually the strongest winds are associated with this bowing portion of the line right in through here. All right, so down on either side of this, you get winds that are not quite as strong. The strongest winds tend to be in the middle of the bow. That's not to say winds aren't strong on either side of here, but just the strongest, it's all relative. The strongest winds are in that bow. And you'll notice how this appears to be cutting off into a kind of vortex. That's a head. It's called a vortex head on the upper edge. And there's actually almost like a low pressure circulation developing at that point. The impacts that you get will vary quite a bit across this. You talk to one boat that goes through this, you're going to experience it in a very different way from another boat that goes through it. Oftentimes they're longer lasting systems, and they're usually nocturnal, usually strongest at night. Not always, but strongest at night. So here's all the radars across the United States. And of course, you can access them at the radar.gov site. So you go to this site, shows you all the composite imagery, and then you can click on an individual site and zoom down. Here's some third-party composite radar viewers. Weather Underground over here on the left, which is nice because you can overlay the observations. And then here's Windy, which a lot of people are using nowadays over here on the right. Again, composite imagery. This is a single site radar viewer called Radar Omega. And this allows you to look at the detail and zoom down and pull up different products and so forth. And then I know a lot of people are using Expedition. Expedition does have the ability to overlay radar from something called Rain Viewer. Be very careful using this. If you're using this, make sure you have a backup. This is not updated regularly. It's really just a way to compare rainfall with model output, not to analyze it for storm impacts. And then I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can use radar interpretation to understand different weather phenomena in the atmosphere. So if you have a broad area of precipitation like this is typically what a warm front would present. The air is rising slowly up over the frontal boundary and spreading out over a large area. This is a warm front there. And then this is a cold front here. This is a long squall line, usually a narrow band of precipitation is associated with a cold front. And there's squall lines are oftentimes close to the front, within 50 to 150 nautical miles, but sometimes there can be bands that extend further out. So just some other ways to interpret the cells. So here's a loop of last year's system. I thought I would show this is 1 hour out of the whole event as the front passed through the center of the lake. So let me just run this real quickly. This is 1 hour of imagery as it's moving across the center of the lake. Now, as it's moving away from the Milwaukee radar and moving toward the Grand Rapids radar. So remember, in this section of the lake, the radar beam is seeing about a mile high in the atmosphere. And so it's actually seeing well up. Now, initially, you can see the outflow boundary from the storm right through here. That's the leading edge of this blue line. It kind of gets broken up as it goes to the north because now the radar is shooting over the top of it. So you can't see it extending out. The other thing to note as you look at this image is the secondary cells that are developing. There's one right here, and that moves sort of northeast. And then there's another one that develops after this, all in the period of about, all in period of 1 hour. There's a couple of these cells that develop. There's one there. And there's another one developing there at the end of this. And this is one of the reasons that it's very difficult and you have to be very careful interpreting the radar data because of these different cells. Each one will have its own outflow boundary. And you can't see the outflow boundaries, and the outflow boundaries start to intersect. And so you may be sitting in the outflow boundary from one cell, and then all of a sudden another cell that might be, some distance away, that outflow boundary comes in and you get another wind shift and another push and pressure. So if in these multicellular situations like this, where the cells are developing and changing quite rapidly, you have to be really careful interpreting the radar. It's not just the fact that that line comes and passes over you, and that's it. There may be another outflow boundary that is still yet to come, or some sort of ghost from an old storm that can get you a second time. Once you're back in this area here in the wake of the storm, things are actually better. So remember, most of the wind is out ahead of the heaviest rain, and the heaviest rain, oftentimes the wind gets lighter. Not always, but oftentimes the wind gets lighter. It's out in the back in this area here, the wind is definitely much lighter, and you're basically in the wake of the storms. It's really this area here where you're, let me circle that. This area here, right at sort of the leading edge, just ahead of the storm, and just underneath the heaviest precipitation echoes is where you're really at risk for the highest wind speeds. But again, nothing is a sure thing. Even though the cell has gone by you, you can still get hit by a second outflow boundary from a cell that may be some distance away, or an old cell that's already rained itself out. It's no longer showing up on the radar, but its outflow is still present. So it's important to never assume that you've quite cleared out of it until you're back in this area of the storm here. So intersecting outflow boundaries can be a real bear. Here's one of my great examples. This happens to be down in South Carolina. There's a sea breeze front here, and then a outflow boundary from some thunderstorms coming in from the west here. And we go to the next image, those two boundaries combine, and we get new thunderstorms that blossom right on the converging outflow boundaries. So that gives you an idea of how, or the different the case. In this case, it's a sea breeze boundary and an outflow boundary, but the same thing can happen in outflow boundaries from two separate thunderstorms. So it's important to be aware of that. So here's some of my bottom lines. First of all, use radar data. It's valuable, and it will give you some warning of bad weather coming. And it's important to know and understand what you're looking at. Don't start using some new tool the day of the start of the race. Make sure you understand how to use the tool, what it's showing you, its update rate, et cetera, et cetera. Get experience with your tools. Use them every time it rains, wherever you are, until you up to the race, so you can relate your experience with the weather with what the radar is showing. And use the same tools and apps that you're going to use on the boat. Okay, don't use different thing. If there's something that you can't take on the boat, don't use that. Use what you're going to use on the boat. Always listen for official warnings and advisories, of course. And then regardless, always proceed with caution around these things. Don't assume you know more than you do. Something can come out of the blue and catch you. Thunderstorm winds come from the direction of the heaviest rainfall. So if it's raining heavier to the north of you, expect the outflow to come from roughly from the north or the northwest out of that heavier rainfall. The strongest winds are often not where the radar is showing the heaviest rain, but the winds spread out ahead of the rain and can spread out some distance from it. And as I showed in that one example, sometimes the strongest winds occur where the radar is clear, not showing any precipitation. Expect the gust front, a shift and increase, to happen well before the radar indicated heaviest rain reaches you. All right, so it's not always the case, but expect it. Sometimes particularly if it's a new thunderstorm, it's just developed, and the outflow boundary hasn't really traveled very far from the radar. The distance between the heavy rainfall and the outflow, the wind shift and gust, may not be very much, but you should be ready before you think the outflow boundary is going to hit you. And again, at night, you don't have the ability to see the clouds moving towards you. So it's always better to assume it's going to hit you sooner rather than later. Remember that gust fronts can spread 50, 100 nautical miles even, or more in some extreme cases, away from the thunderstorm. So that's what I just mentioned. Sometimes you'll be sailing along and there were some thunderstorms earlier, but they're no longer present or on the radar. They've moved east off the lake. The outflow boundaries may still be there. Because they're cold air, they're heavy and dense, they have lots of momentum and they take time to dissipate. That's supposed to be all one thing, that the 100 miles or more away from the parent storm, and they can be very impactful. The gust fronts often bring colder, more dense air that is more powerful than the humid air. So in other words, not only are you increasing your wind speed, you're also increasing the density or the weight of the air, and so it has more power to it. If you know that your boat behaves differently on a hot, humid day sailing off of Chicago from a cold fall day, you know what I'm talking about. The same wind speed will have a lot more power in it when the temperature is lower. And that happens immediately across an outflow boundary. You go into colder air and immediately the density of the air increases. So be aware of outflows reaching you, even though once a storm has subsided. Proceed with caution. Secondary outflows and return breezes can occur. Return breezes meaning flow from the backside of thunderstorms. So those are my things to always be aware of around thunderstorms, and how they should, how careful you need to be in interpreting the radar information. I hope that was helpful. Win?
Thanks, Chris. So there, I think that there was a question that just popped up about what's the usual direction of the gust front, like where does it come from? And I think maybe if one more time you could describe from an individual cell or from a line, the direction, and maybe go back to an image of the gust front or outflow boundary and where it comes from.
Yeah. Let me see if I can put up.
And while you're doing that, I mean, I think the takeaway, I think, is great. That kind of, we're, the shoreline of Wisconsin is 45 miles from the nearest radar. The shoreline of Michigan is 45 miles from the nearest radar. So by the time those beams get over the middle of the lake, if you're relying on that to tell you anything about the gust fronts, the winds, anything at the surface, it's not the right tool for it, right? It's right for the general, weather's going to be bad, but not for the specific, we're through the gust front, there's another gust front, not for that information whatsoever. I think that's kind of the moral of the story, right?
Yes, that is absolutely the moral of the story. So you should be seeing
Yeah.
my whiteboard come up here. You see
First,
that?
yes.
Okay, so where does the wind come from? If you have a thunderstorm, let's make a simple case, and the radar has all kinds of red returns coming right here in this circle. What happens is the wind basically flows outward in all directions like this. So the wind that you experience is a function of where you are relative to the storm. So if you are here, you'll get a shift of from some northerly direction. If you're here, you'll get a shift and an increase from some westerly direction. If you're up here, you'll get a shift and an increase from some southerly direction. Now that's the simple case. However, keep in mind that the thunderstorm exists in a background wind field. So if the background wind is from the southwest, then that outflow boundary will be pushing against that wind. So it has to be strong enough to overcome. And what will happen is it won't travel. It'll still travel and it'll still have strong wind behind it, but it won't travel as quickly. Meanwhile, out on this side of the storm, the outflow boundary may extend further away from the storm. And so where you are relative to the downdraft is the key to understanding what direction the shift is going to come from. Now, in the case of a line of storms, so if you have a line of storms like this, then there's oftentimes just a, sort of a boundary that extends out from the storms like this, running out ahead of them as they progress. This would be the squall line case. Sometimes there's heavier cells sort of within that, within the overall squall line, and the outflow boundary will do this. But again, it's still generally coming out from those cells. So the experience, what you experience, depends on where you are relative to where the heaviest rainfall is and where the downdraft is being generated from.
And these are all sort of idealized cases too, right? It gets much more complicated, much more quickly, as you showed earlier.
In real life, yeah, it's very complicated. These are all conceptual things. Yep. In real life, it'll be something very different.
Okay, we've got two more questions in chat that I think are pretty quick questions, Chris, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
Okay.
Number one is whether the storm height has any correlation to the strength of the outflow gust front. And then the second one is about the use of onboard radar. So if you've got a 2K radar or something like that for identifying, the kind of storm structure and issues.
Okay. The first one is, yes, the taller a thunderstorm is, typically the heavier the rain, the stronger the outflow boundary is. That's not always the case, though. Don't assume that just because this storm only goes up to 25,000 feet and not 45,000 doesn't mean it can't produce a very effectual downdraft and outflow boundary. But normally, the higher the storm, the stronger the winds will be around the storm. To the second question about onboard radar, no.
Would you care to elaborate a little, please?
Just no. Number one, you don't use it that often to be able to interpret it. Number two, as you saw, thunderstorms come and go very quickly. And just when you think you have something figured out, it's going to change and do something different. Number three, your radar doesn't really extend far enough away to be able to tell anything. Just no. Use the best thing you can do is use your onboard system to access external radar. The other thing is, remember that quite often those outflow boundaries aren't where there's precipitation occurring. So your radar is not going to reflect off of anything anyway. So you're probably not going to see it. You'll be able to see the core of the heavy rain, but you're already in the storm at that point.
Okay, one more question from Nancy Snyders. I've heard NOAA reporting an oncoming storm as having winds that are max 34 miles per hour. They usually use this phrase preceding a storm that in reality has much higher winds. I had a meteorologist tell me that 34 mile per hour means NOAA doesn't know, so we should take heed. Is that true? That's a loaded question, Nancy, but I'm going to let Chris answer it anyway.
No, it's not true. Other than 34 knots is the gale trigger. So when winds get to 34 knots, there's a gale. So what they're saying is the winds could be gale force in the storm, and gale force is anything from 34 to 50 knots. So yeah, it's not that they don't know. They don't know exactly. What they're telling you is they're going to be strong winds. And honestly, if they say there's going to be 34 knots, you should be battening down the hatches regardless. Don't think, oh, only 34 knots. That's nothing. 34 knots is plenty.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. I'm going to try and answer maybe another question or two inside of the chat as we wrap up here. But Chris, thank you very, very much. I think, if the goal was to get people better at using radar on Lake Michigan, again, the points that you made about how complicated it can get at the surface and how little information we have at the surface because where our weather radars are located, I think are really critical takeaways. Again, we are going to take this recording and we're going to post it on our YouTube channel. I'll be sending out probably an email to the fleet with a link to it. I think it's valuable tell all your friends, for goodness sake, about this presentation to come take a look at it. So thank you very, very much, Chris. We appreciate your time. We look forward to seeing you in July at the race for the briefing. 319 boats and counting, right? We're doing great. And yeah, we look forward to it. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Chris. I'm going to answer one question in the chat and then I'm going to shut it down. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.